12:41 in the morning on March 8th, 2014, a Boeing 777-200ER, registered as 9 Mike Romeo Oscar, lifted off from runway 32 right at Kuala Lumpur International Airport. The flight was designated MH370, bound for Beijing Capital International Airport. According to the filed flight plan, the duration was estimated at 5 hours and 34 minutes. The aircraft carried 227 passengers and 12 crew members. The conditions for departure were recorded as favorable, with standard visibility and no significant meteorological impediments logged by the tower. To understand the trajectory of the investigation that followed, one must first examine the operational baseline of the aircraft and the individuals on board. The doctrine of evidence requires a separation of narrative assumption from documented fact. The aircraft had accumulated 53,465 hours of flight time. Maintenance records indicate that its last major inspection had been completed 10 days prior, on February 27th, at the Malaysia Airlines hangar. No significant defects were noted in the logbook. The engineering report signed off on the condition of the plane, certifying it as airworthy. The cockpit was occupied by 2 pilots with disparate levels of experience. In the left seat sat Captain Zahiri Ahmed Shah, a 53-year-old veteran with 18,365 flying hours. Company records show he had been with the airline since 1981. He was a type rating examiner, authorized to conduct simulator tests for other pilots. His roster indicated he was well rested. In the right seat was First Officer Farik Abdul Hamid, 27 years old. He had 2,763 total flying hours. This specific flight was a training sector for him. He was transitioning to the Boeing 777, and this was his final flight before being fully checked out on the aircraft type. The passenger manifest listed individuals from 14 different nations. 153 were citizens of China, while 38 were Malaysian. The remaining passengers included citizens from Indonesia, Australia, India, France, the United States, New Zealand, Ukraine, Canada, Russia, Taiwan, and the Netherlands. During the subsequent investigation, a procedural anomaly was flagged in the manifest review. 2 passengers were listed as traveling on passports issued by Austria and Italy. Interpol databases confirmed that both documents had been reported lost or stolen in Thailand in 2012 and 2013, respectively. Closed-circuit television footage from the terminal showed the 2 individuals passing through security and boarding the aircraft. While this discovery initially directed the investigation toward a security breach. Background checks on the two Iranian nationals utilizing these documents suggested they were seeking asylum in Europe rather than intending to interfere with the aircraft. The cargo manifest presented another layer of complexity that investigators would later deconstruct. The load sheet indicated a total cargo weight of 10,806 kilograms. Included in this inventory were 4,566 kilograms of fresh mangosteens and 2,453 kilograms of small items consolidated by a logistics company. Among those consolidated items were 221 kilograms of lithium-ion batteries. The documentation for these batteries noted they were packed in accordance with the International Air Transport Association dangerous goods regulations. However, the placement of volatile cargo on a passenger aircraft would become a focal point during the analysis of potential fire scenarios. The timeline of the flight's initial phase followed standard operating procedures. At 12:42 in the morning, the aircraft climbed to flight level 180. Air traffic control transcripts record the communication between the cockpit and the Kuala Lumpur Area Control Center. The tone was professional. Instructions were acknowledged and executed. At 12:46, the aircraft was cleared to flight level 250. 4 minutes later, at 12:50, the flight reached flight level 350, its cruising altitude. The aircraft communications addressing and reporting system, known as ACARS, transmitted routine data bursts to the ground station. These automated messages provided snapshots of the aircraft's performance, including engine health and fuel levels. The 12:30 ACARS transmission showed no anomalies. The 107 ACARS transmission, the final automated report sent by the system, also indicated all systems were operating within normal parameters. The fuel on board was recorded at 49,100 kilograms, sufficient for the flight to Beijing with the required reserves. As the aircraft approached the edge of Malaysian airspace, it tracked toward a navigational waypoint designated as IGARI over the South China Sea. This position marks the boundary between the Kuala Lumpur Flight Information Region and the Ho Chi Minh Flight Information Region. At 1:19 in the morning, the Kuala Lumpur Area Control Center radioed the flight, instructing them to contact Ho Chi Minh on frequency 120.9. A voice from the cockpit, later identified by forensic audio analysis as likely belonging to Captain Zahiri, replied, "Good night, Malaysian 370. This transmission, logged at 1:19 and 30 seconds, was the final verbal contact from the flight. The events that transpired in the subsequent minutes form the crux of the procedural failure delayed the search and response. According to radar logs, at 1:21 and 13 seconds, less than 2 minutes after the final voice transmission, the aircraft's position symbol on the radar screen of the Kuala Lumpur Control Center disappeared. This indicated that the transponder, the device that transmits the aircraft's identity and altitude to secondary radar systems, had ceased transmission. Procedurally, when a transponder signal is lost, the aircraft should still be visible on primary radar, which relies on radio waves bouncing off the physical fuselage rather than a signal sent from the plane. However, primary radar lacks the identifying data tags. To the air traffic controllers in Kuala Lumpur, the specific blip identified as MH370 vanished. At this precise moment, the aircraft was crossing into Vietnamese airspace. The responsibility for tracking the flight was transferring to Ho Chi Minh Area Control Center. However, the investigation revealed that Ho Chi Minh ATC did not establish two-way radio communication with the aircraft. Protocol dictates that if a flight fails to check in within 5 minutes of the estimated transfer time, the receiving station must alert the transferring station. Records indicate a significant lapse in this protocol. It was not until 1:38 in the morning, 17 minutes after the transponder failed, that Ho Chi Minh ATC contacted Kuala Lumpur ATC to inquire about the location of the flight. This 17-minute gap was critical. During this window, the aircraft was no longer being actively tracked by civilian controllers, who assumed it was in the other's jurisdiction. The confusion was compounded by an operational error involving the airline's operations center. When Kuala Lumpur ATC contacted Malaysia Airlines Operations to ask if they could track the plane, the operations staff initially stated that the aircraft was exchanging signals with a flight location request in Cambodia. This information was erroneous. The flight path did not go through Cambodia. The reliance on this incorrect projection led air traffic controllers to focus their attention north, believing the aircraft was still flying, rather than initiating distress protocols for a missing aircraft. It was not until 3:30 in the morning that the Airline Operations Center corrected the error, admitting the flight tracking message was based on projection, not actual data. By this time, the aircraft had been silent and off course for over 2 hours. The official distress phase, known in aviation terms as DTRSFA, was not issued by Kuala Lumpur Rescue Coordination Center until 5:30 in the morning, 4 hours after the initial loss of contact. While civilian radar had lost the flight, military radar systems were operating in the region. A review of the Royal Malaysian Air Force radar playback, conducted days after the disappearance, revealed a primary radar target likely corresponded to MH370. This target did not proceed to Beijing. Instead, the data suggests that immediately after the transponder ceased transmission at IGARI waypoint, the aircraft initiated a sharp turn to the left. The radar return showed the aircraft flying back across the Malay Peninsula. Contrary to its filed flight plan, it passed south of Penang Island and then turned northwest up the Straits of Malacca. This flight path was consistent with a deliberate navigation input rather than an uncontrolled mechanical failure. The aircraft was navigating by waypoints: VAMPI, GIVAL, IGREX, standard navigational fixes used by commercial pilots. During this window, a significant piece of electronic evidence was recorded. At 1:52 in the morning, a cell phone tower on Penang detected a signal from a mobile device registered to the first officer. The record shows a brief connection, known as a handshake, between the device and the ground station. This confirms the aircraft was flying at a low enough altitude and close enough proximity to land for a cellular connection to be established, however briefly. Procedurally, the military radar operators did not flag this unidentified target as a threat at the time. The classification of the target as non-hostile meant that no interceptor jets were scrambled to visually identify the aircraft. This decision was later cited as a missed opportunity to determine the status of the plane while it was still within range of recovery. At 2:22 in the morning, the primary radar target disappeared from the scope of the military radar located at Butterworth. The final recorded position placed the aircraft 200 nautical miles northwest of Penang, heading out into the vast, unmonitored expanse of the Andaman Sea. The investigation that began that morning faced an immediate deficit of tangible evidence. The timeline established by the records ended abruptly at 1:21 in the morning with the loss of the transponder. All subsequent data relied on the reconstruction of primary radar returns, and later the analysis of satellite handshakes. The context of the disappearance was defined not by what was found, but by the silence and the procedural gaps that allowed a Boeing 777 to exit the monitored world without leaving a digital footprint of its destination. While the aircraft was invisible to standard radar, it was not entirely disconnected from the global network. Although the ACARS data transmission system had been disabled, the satellite communication terminal, or SATCOM, remained powered. According to logs provided by Inmarsat, the satellite operator, the ground station, sent a log-on request to the aircraft at 2:25 in the morning. The aircraft's terminal responded. This automated handshake indicated that the plane was still powered and flying. Over the next 6 hours, the ground station sent a series of hourly signals, known as pings, to the aircraft to confirm connectivity. The aircraft acknowledged each ping. These handshakes did not contain GPS location data, speed, or altitude. However, they provided two specific variables: burst timing offset and burst frequency offset. The burst timing offset measures the time it takes for the signal to travel from the satellite to the plane and back. This time delay allows investigators to calculate the distance of the aircraft from the satellite, creating a series of concentric circles, or arcs, on the map. The burst frequency offset measures the Doppler shift of the signal, the change in frequency caused by the movement of the satellite and the aircraft relative to each other. Analysis of this frequency shift indicated the direction of the flight. The data revealed that after disappearing from military radar at 2:22 in the morning, the aircraft executed another turn. The Doppler analysis determined that the plane turned south. For the next several hours, Flight 370 flew into the remote expanse of the southern Indian Ocean. The final handshake occurred at 8:19 in the morning local time. This signal was incomplete, a log-on request initiated by the aircraft rather than the ground station. Technical analysis suggests this reboot was likely caused by a power interruption, consistent with fuel exhaustion and the subsequent flameout of the engines. 8 seconds later, a final transmission was received. Following this, there was no further communication. Based on fuel consumption models, by 8:11 in the morning, the engines would have flamed out due to fuel exhaustion. At that hour, there was no physical trace of the aircraft. There was no distress signal. The aircraft had been carrying fuel for approximately 7.5 hours of flight. The search led by the Australian Transport Safety Bureau focused on a narrow strip of ocean defined by the 7th arc. The calculated position of the aircraft at the time of the final signal. This underwater search involved the use of side-scan sonar and autonomous underwater vehicles to map the sea floor. The depth of the search area ranged from 600 meters to 6,000 meters. The terrain was rugged, featuring underwater volcanoes and deep trenches. Despite the comprehensive mapping of over 120,000 square kilometers of ocean floor, the main fuselage was not located during this phase. Initial operations in the southern sector also focused on surface debris. Satellite imagery from various nations identified hundreds of potential objects floating in the water. Procedural logs show that military aircraft were dispatched to visually verify these leads. Air crews flew 10-hour missions, with only 2 hours of on-station time due to the extreme distance from land. Despite hundreds of sorties, no material connected to the aircraft was recovered during the surface search phase. The objects identified by satellites turned out to be fishing debris, cargo containers, or biological matter. Additionally, a ship named the Ocean Shield was deployed with a towed pinger locator, a hydrophone designed to detect the ultrasonic pulses emitted by the underwater locator beacons attached to the flight data recorder and the cockpit voice recorder. These beacons have a battery life of approximately 30 days. On April 5th and 8th, the Ocean Shield crew recorded a series of acoustic signals that were initially believed to be consistent with the frequency of the black boxes. However, subsequent analysis by acoustic experts cast doubt on the signals. The frequencies were determined to be widespread in the ocean environment, likely caused by ship noise or marine life, rather than the man-made pulse of a locator beacon. Physical evidence of the flight eventually surfaced, not in the search zone, but thousands of kilometers away on the shores of East Africa and islands in the Western Indian Ocean. This drift analysis became a secondary branch of the investigation. On July 29th, 2015, a maintenance worker on Reunion Island discovered a large piece of debris. French aviation experts identified the object as a flaperon, a control surface from the wing of a Boeing 777. The serial numbers found inside the flaperon matched the records of Malaysia Airlines Flight 370. This was the first tangible proof that the flight had terminated in the water. The condition of the flaperon was scrutinized by forensic experts. The damage to the trailing edge suggested that the flaperon was still attached to the wing when it impacted the water. The fracture patterns suggested that the flaperon was not deployed in a landing position at the time of impact. This specific detail was entered into the file as evidence regarding the final moments of the flight, suggesting that the aircraft did not enter the water in a controlled ditching configuration. Furthermore, the marine biology report on the barnacles attached to the debris provided clues regarding the water temperature and the duration of time the object had been submerged. The species of barnacles, Lepus anatifera, are consistent with drift patterns originating in the colder waters of the southern Indian Ocean. Subsequent discoveries of debris in Mozambique, South Africa, and Mauritius provided further data points. A piece of the horizontal stabilizer and a flap track fairing were recovered. Each item was cataloged and subjected to drift modeling. Oceanographers used reverse drift analysis to trace the path of the debris back to a likely point of origin. While the ocean currents in the Indian Ocean are highly variable, the models were generally consistent with the search area determined by the satellite data. The investigation also delved into the background of the individuals on the flight deck. Police files indicate that the captain had a home flight simulator Forensic analysis of the hard drives from this simulator revealed data points from a simulated flight that closely mirrored the actual path taken by the aircraft, specifically the turn into the southern Indian Ocean. However, the report noted that these points were part of a larger volume of data and did not constitute definitive proof of intent. The timeline of the simulator data creation was also ambiguous, leaving room for interpretation regarding its relevance. Cargo manifests were scrutinized for hazardous materials to test the hypothesis that a fire originating in the cargo hold could have incapacitated the crew and disabled the electrical systems. While lithium-ion batteries present a known fire risk, the systematic way in which the transponder and ACARS were disabled, followed by the controlled turn and the long duration of the subsequent flight, made the fire theory difficult to reconcile with the evidence. A fire severe enough to disable communications would likely have resulted in a loss of structural integrity much sooner than the 7 hours the aircraft remained airborne. The final report issued by the safety investigation team was unable to determine the precise cause for the disappearance. The report highlighted the significant gap in real-time tracking capabilities for commercial aircraft over open oceans. It cited the failure of the transponder and the inability to override the manual deactivation from the ground as critical vulnerabilities. The investigation concluded that the aircraft turned back under manual control, but the specific reasons for the actions of the person at the controls could not be established without the recovery of the flight data recorder and the cockpit voice recorder. The incident is defined by a duality: the tangible, recorded path of the aircraft flying south into the Indian Ocean, confirmed by satellite mathematics, and the chaotic, delayed reaction of ground control caused by jurisdictional confusion and misinterpreted data. The separation between the aircraft's physical reality and the investigators' assumptions delayed the relevant response by days, allowing the physical evidence on the surface of the ocean to disperse before a credible search area could be established. The timeline remains the only absolute certainty. At 12:41, the plane took off. At 1:19, voice contact ceased. At 1:21, the electronic identity vanished. At 8:19, the satellite received its final handshake. Between the silence and the ocean, the procedural record ends, leaving a file that is technically open, yet devoid of a final resolution.